Hello and welcome to folks just tuning in, and welcome back to those of you who were with us earlier today. My name is Erin Aoyama, and it is my pleasure to serve as the moderator for this panel entitled Creating Paths to Justice, Healing, and Renewal. As we gather together virtually, I invite each of us to acknowledge the Native peoples whose ancestral homelands we currently occupy, and to learn more about the past and presence of the vibrant Native communities who make their homes here today. As we mark this weekend the significance of this day in history for Nikkei communities across North America, let us not, in doing so, cover over the backdrop of enslavement, genocide, and removal that animates American history. Over the course of the next hour, we will hear from 5 speakers: Karen Korematsu, Mia Russell, Kimiko Marr, Barbara Takei, and Michael Ishii, about what those terms in the title, justice, healing, and renewal, mean for them within the work that they do. Each speaker, as you will soon learn if you don't know already, is a powerful, thoughtful, and committed community member, and we are so grateful to have them with us today. We will have time for a Q&A discussion later in the program, so please leave any questions or thoughts you'd like to share with our panelists in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. So without further ado, I am honored to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Karen Korematsu. Karen is the founder and executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute and the daughter of the late civil rights icon Fred Korematsu. Through her work, Karen travels the country advocating for civil liberties, ethnic studies education, and social justice, encouraging COVID-19 vaccination in AAPI communities, and promoting the Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution on January 30th. Karen has received numerous awards and honors and recognitions for her work, and was recently recognized to serve as a State of California Education Ambassador. Karen, thank you so very much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for that kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for tuning in today. I hope we're not just preaching to the choir, that we also have in our audience people that want to learn more about the World War II Japanese American incarceration as it relates to our issues today. I also like to thank the Smithsonian American History Museum and other organizations that have helped to sponsor this program. This is the National Day of Remembrance. And I always have very mixed emotions when it comes to this day, because here we are 80 years later, and the lessons of history, and to come to this point in our country when clearly we haven't is disheartening. However, we need to be inspired. And by all of those that are out there speaking on this day, and to encourage others to participate in our civics in our country. Next. My father, in case many of you don't know, his one of his famous quotes was "Stand up for what is right." And when we're talking about justice in this country, that's what he represents in his landmark Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus United States, which was decided against him in 1944, was reopened in 1983 when the evidence was that proved that there was no military necessity for the Japanese Americans to be forcibly removed from their homes. At the time of my father's Supreme Court case, that the Department of Justice had lied, altered, and suppressed evidence. Therefore, this is what we always need to be on guard about, especially with the Supreme Court issues of today. And even though my father's Supreme Court decision was addressed again in Trump versus Hawaii, it's still on the Supreme Court record. It was only, quote, a comment from Chief Justice Roberts that it was overturned in the court of history. That did not support the upholding the majority opinion in Trump versus Hawaii. So that's the confusion, and his case has been used all over the United States in regarding the COVID issues incorrectly, because to stay at home, to wear a mask is to uphold our responsibility for social justice. So we promote civic education, and we work to educate people of the importance to participate. Next. And so over the years, actually our education program, from starting from really 2009, when I first established the organization, until now, has evolved. And we are working on other projects that are not just curriculum, but of national impact. A grant with the API, a health forum and regarding COVID. Next. And also now what we want to emphasize is a project that we are is in development. This will have national impact as we have this this exhibit. This will be a traveling exhibit that will go from city to city, and to have the conversations of the mistakes of our past and what's happening now. The intersectionality is important to emphasize, and we'll be doing that in this exhibit, looking still for foundation partners to help support our project. This is a major undertaking, and we feel that now it's more important than ever that we need to educate about the past, but to bring in those relevant issues today of immigration, of voting, of marginalized communities, and we will continue to work on this, and hopefully we'll launch it soon. And as far as the intersectionality of communities, I just spoke at the Dallas Holocaust Museum and I should say the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, which shows the intersectionality of our work. But also, I was proud to see that my father was featured as a upstander. And we all need to be upstanding and to participate in making the difference of in this country and addressing those issues that we see are clearly a big divide. Also, last year, the Roosevelt Institute, and in coming full circle, has honored my father last year posthumously with the Four Freedoms Award. And the Roosevelt Board Chair, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, said, "While, quote, while I cannot undo the harm caused by this forced incarceration policy, I can acknowledge its cruelty and restate my family's commitment to historical repair and redress," unquote. That's huge. That's huge for the Roosevelt Institute to admit that and to recognize it and to honor really all Japanese Americans that were incarcerated. Now is the time when we need to fully participate and in our communities. Next. Just briefly, we do have curriculum that teachers and educators and parents can go to our website. Next. And as I mentioned, we're continuing our second phase of our grant with the Health Forum. Next. And also you can go to our website, www.korematsuinstitute.org for more information. And remember my father's words, don't be afraid to speak up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing about all of the work that you're doing and the legacy of your father. Next, I'm so delighted to welcome a very dear friend and colleague and public historian extraordinaire, Mia Russell. Mia is manager of the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium, also called JAXI, a nationwide coalition of organizations working to elevate the history and social justice lessons of the World War II experiences of Japanese Americans. Mia previously served as executive director of the Friends of Minidoka, the nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the Minidoka camp. Mia, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Erin. And it's such an honor to be here with the other panelists today. And I want to thank the National Park Service and the Smithsonian for hosting us today. So as Erin said, I'm with the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium, and we work to preserve, protect, and interpret historic sites, artifacts, and experiences, as well as elevate the social justice lessons of this World War II experience. We are a fairly young organization with our first official convenings taking place in 2016. But in many ways, our consortium is born from the impacts of the wartime incarceration. One of these impacts was the forced assimilation of Japanese Americans by the design of the US government. Families were forcibly displaced to far-flung places, with subsequent government resettlement programs designed to further separate their communities. A stated intent of the government was to break up the threat of the Japantowns. That disjointed resettlement program, coupled with the trauma of the incarceration, resulted in decades of shame and silence that wasn't broken into the early pilgrimages and days of remembrance in the 70s and redress hearings in the 1980s. Now, if we fast forward to 2009, the first Japanese American confinement sites grants began to be distributed through the National Park Service. Since then, $35 million in funding has been distributed for 269 projects in 24 states and Washington, D.C. These grants have supported historic reconstruction of the confinement sites, exhibitions, documentaries, educational curricula, oral histories, photograph digitization, and so much more. In the last 12 or so years, there's been an incredible amount of energy nationwide by dedicated friends groups, museums, universities, educational and advocacy organizations of all sizes towards the preservation and education of these sites and stories. So many of the structures and interpretive exhibits and documentaries that visitors can see today at the historic campsites, whether preserved through the Park Service or even at museums not located at the sites, these have all been made possible through this JAX program. There was concern that there was a disconnect between organizations, though, and as a result, that important work was occurring in geographic silos and was sometimes duplicative. Much of that disconnect can be seen as an ongoing ripple effect of the incarceration. So the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, the Japanese American National Museum, Japanese American Citizens League, and others thought that there was great potential to uplift both the individual organizations and the field as a whole if we were all to work more collaboratively, and the consortium was born from that vision. So the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation received 2 JAX grants to seed the consortium, and through these, we were able to convene professionals and community organizers from nationwide and have formative conversations about the state of our field and evaluating the resources and technical expertise that existed within our ranks. We found that we had common goals, common concerns, common problems that we had all been working to solve individually, and we have since become a formalized coalition with 3 main goals. So capacity building, we work together to build the capacity for all member organizations and our capacity as a collective. We found that even just being in close communication with each other, we've seen a huge increase in collaborative projects and resource sharing between organizations. And we hold an annual educational conference to advance the field and serve as an intensive learning opportunity for practitioners and the general public. Second, we defend against threats. This could be the sale of artifacts, development threats to historic sites and structures, and environmental justice threats, like the Lava Ridge wind farm currently threatening Minidoka National Historic Site. And finally, we engage in advocacy. This includes annual advocacy efforts around federal programs like the JAX Grant Program that support the work of our members. We advocate for the further protection of sites, including Amachi, which is poised to become the next unit of the National Park Service very soon. And we're currently working to secure the Japanese American Confinement Education Act, which is HR 1931 or Senate Bill 988, to reauthorize another $32 million in funding for the JAX Grant Program, and additional $10 million in education-specific funding to support a collaborative national effort to create curricula and resources to ensure that every student is able to learn about the incarceration history. Moving forward, we want to continue to uplift our community and the field as a whole by working in tandem, fostering collaboration, sharing resources and technical expertise, and having a powerful and united voice in advocating for our community and for others. And I think a perfect example of all of this is the organizations and individuals that have come together in support of this weekend's DOR commemoration, both for our own community healing, but also in service of educating the general public about this history. And it's a powerful statement of what we can accomplish together.
Thank you so much, Mia. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our next speaker, Kimiko Marr, who is also simultaneously running our production backstage. Kimiko is a Yonsei, or fourth generation Japanese American, and co-founder of Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages, JAMP. Her family's history of incarceration at Topaz in Utah during World War II inspires her to share the experiences of Japanese Americans in their own words. Kimiko, thank you so much for being here and sharing about your work, and which we're also experiencing to some extent. Thank you so much also for that work.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you. I'm really honored to be on this panel with everybody today. I'm just going to start by telling a little bit about how I got involved, a little bit about my backstory personally. I actually was not raised in a community where there were any Asians even, so let alone Japanese Americans. So I actually grew up outside of Kansas City, Missouri. And I never grew up with a community of Japanese Americans. So I never really felt connected in any way to others other than my own family. So when I was invited to attend my first pilgrimage in 2016, I had no idea what to expect. I never even knew that there were pilgrimages. That's how far outside the community that I was. But I was invited to go to the Minidoka pilgrimage. And for me, it was absolutely life-changing because I was surrounded by people that looked like me, people that had similar experiences than me, people who looked like my aunties and grandma and everybody. And I just felt like I had found my community, my place, my space in this world. And so I wanted to share that with other people, other Nikkei or other Japanese in diaspora. So I started attending other pilgrimages. And in fact, our company has actually received 2 different Japanese American confinement sites grants. So thank you, Jaxie, for that, which allowed us to film oral histories at some of these pilgrimages. And also 2 years ago, when the pandemic started, we did virtual programming, which turned out to be way bigger than I had ever imagined. But I think that what it did was it brought a little bit of that community feeling that you get when you go to a physical pilgrimage, but it allowed us to reach people all over the world. And so I think that it's that feeling of community that you get when you go to a pilgrimage, but also even when you participate in online programming that allows us to start having these really difficult conversations about who we are, what we represent, what we want, and what we want for the future. And so I think that creating that, like allowing that space, allowing people to feel comfortable in that space has kind of helped with having more dialogue just within our own community, which I think helps inform us on how we want to speak about our own community outside of our community. And I'm actually not, don't have much else to say, Erin, so come back up here.
Thank you so much, Kimiko. I'm excited to get into some of what you've mentioned during the Q&A at the end, which this is also a reminder for folks who are watching along. Please leave any questions or thoughts you might have in the chat. We'd love to really have this be a conversation towards the end. So next, I'm really delighted to introduce Barbara Takei. Barbara is a Sansei, or third-generation Japanese American, who was raised in Detroit and graduated from Howard University, a historically Black research university. Since 2000, Barbara has worked with the Tule Lake Committee to preserve and interpret protest histories at and from Tule Lake concentration camp, where over 12,000 Nikkei were segregated and criminalized because they resisted the unjust World War II incarceration. Barbara, thank you so much for the work that you do to preserve and share these stories, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Erin, for having me on the program. I really appreciate the organizers of the program, the Park Service and the Smithsonian, for this opportunity to talk about Tule Lake's very significant but little known history of civil rights protests during World War II, plus an opportunity to talk about our ongoing fight to stop the FAA from destroying the historic site. So as far as significance for our audience, Tule Lake is located in Northern California. It is one of America's 10 concentration camps. And it is, I feel, the most significant camp because in 1943, it was turned into a maximum security segregation center that was created to punish Japanese Americans the government deemed disloyal. So this whole idea of disloyalty was a racist construction that was imposed by the government, assigned to those who refused to cooperate or gave wrong answers on a mandatory government loyalty questionnaire that has just widely been criticized by historians and others as just as bad as the forced removal and the incarceration. It was given months after people had given up everything to cooperate and leave their homes and communities to be incarcerated in the government's concentration camps. So 10% of the imprisoned Japanese Americans used this questionnaire to express their dissatisfaction with the incarceration. And the government then used their responses to divide Japanese American families into false categories of either being loyal or disloyal. Those who were deemed disloyal, they were also known as no-nos, were segregated to Tule Lake, making Tule Lake the largest concentration camp with a peak population of close to 19,000 people. It's almost twice as large as most of the camps. Kimiko, can you put up the chart showing the camps? So you can see all of the movement of people who were segregated into Tule Lake. There was almost 12,000 people who were added to the population. 6,500 were removed from Tule Lake, but it made Tule Lake a very crowded camp. And you might also note that the smallest numbers were from Grenada, also known as Amachi, and Minidoka, which were considered to be the better managed camps. The larger numbers, again, are, you look at the camps, these are the camps where they had the most, they were mismanaged, there was a lot of conflict, and people were using the questionnaire as a way to express their dissatisfaction. So Tule Lake ended up gaining a battalion of 1,000 soldiers to guard all the people defined as disloyal. And the Department of Justice began planning to denationalize and to deport Japanese Americans who dared to protest the injustice of their treatment. Kimiko, can you put up the comic book? Yeah. So this is Green Hornet comic. It was published in July 1944, the same month the government, Congress passed and President Roosevelt signed an order permitting Japanese American citizens to renounce their U.S. citizenship. So this was part of a plan to demonize protesters as disloyal, pro-Japan fanatics, and troublemakers, which were racist stereotypes that persisted long after World War II. And this racist propaganda tended to suppress the stories of Japanese protesters. Because look, as you can see, just looking at the comic book cover, the horrible, the way that protesters were viewed as, it was the face of evil. Protesters were not celebrated, and tragically, for most of their lifetimes, Tule Lake's dissidents carried great shame for their acts of dissent. So you can take that slide down, but it's it gives you an idea of the kind of wartime propaganda that infused the way Japanese Americans were perceived by the outside and the way they perceived or they understood America to see protesters. So the stories of protest have been submerged for most of the post-war years. And so it's been really only in the past 20 years that the Tule Lake Committee's pilgrimages sought to remember and to honor those who protested the government's injustice. So at each pilgrimage over the years, we've celebrated the people who had the courage to stand up and speak out. And this was an intentional way to begin bringing the stories of protest and dissent back into the Japanese American narrative. And of course, our hope is that families of people who were incarcerated in Tule Lake will cherish these stories, feel proud of the fact that their family members protested and helped preserve these stories. So the National Park Service has worked to create the Tule Lake National Monument. We're now part of the National Park Service, which for the government to be telling the story of segregation has been a huge boost in validating and honoring Tule Lake segregation history. The site is now preparing a new a temporary visitor center that's off the road, and we're all looking forward to once COVID makes it safe going up there. But despite Tule Lake's significance, our community is in a David and Goliath battle to save the Tule Lake site from destruction. And perversely, our main adversary is the Department of Transportation's Federal Aviation Administration, which is the FAA. So in the years when Jim Crow was still law of the land, the FAA decided the concentration camp site was a good place to build an airfield for crop dusters. And that airfield has remained. But since 2010, the Japanese American community has been fighting to stop the FAA from expanding the Tule Lake airfield and destroying the Tule Lake site because the FAA wants to build an 8-foot-high, 3-mile-long fence around the airfield. And it is a fence that we feel will destroy the historic fabric of a rare civil rights site for the Japanese American community, and also send a message of indifference, that they are indifferent to Japanese American history. So, Yesterday I was really pleased to read President Biden's Day of Remembrance proclamation, where he committed to maintain Japanese American national park sites and national historic landmark sites. So we asked the Biden administration to keep that commitment and help us protect this rare historic site from the FAA. We hope the administration will help us save the place where Japanese Americans resisted injustice during World War II, which is our civil rights history. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And you raise such important points about the ways that there is no single story. There is no one truth. There's no one narrative to any of these histories. And these stories of resistance and protest are so important to continue excavating. So I'm really looking forward to returning to this conversation again during the Q&A. And finally, I am so happy to introduce our final speaker of today, Michael Ishii. Mike is a Yonsei from Seattle and has lived in New York City for 3 decades. He studied music at the Oberlin Conservatory and Juilliard School and East Asian medicine in the United States and in China. Mike is co-chair of the New York Day of Remembrance Committee and a founding co-chair of Tsuru for Solidarity, a national movement of Japanese American activists working to end detention and state violence in the United States. His medicinal practice, art, and activism focus on healing multi-generational effects of racism and violence. Mike, we are so honored to have you here today. We know it's a very busy day and weekend for you, so thank you for taking the time to share some thoughts with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Erin. It's such an honor to be on this panel with my buddies and friends here. I want to start paying homage to the Tule Lake pilgrimage, because actually that's really where Tsuru for Solidarity started. And in the summer of 2018, during the Trump administration, when they were enacting the zero tolerance policy, and that was when children were being ripped out of the arms of their parents at the border and being put in cages. At the Tule Lake pilgrimage, Barbara approached me and she said, "Would you organize a protest against this?" And that was that summer we had brought a number of Japanese American community organizers to the pilgrimage, and it was really an important gathering for our community. A lot of like-minded organizers came together and were very upset about what was going on, with talk of Muslim registries and Muslim travel bans, and of course what was going on at the southern border with family separation and child detention. It's out of that action that summer that Satsuki Ina, Nancy Ukai, and myself really came together and started organizing. And sort of the rest is history now, 3 years later. But for those of you who are not familiar with Tsuru, it's really a movement of affiliated Japanese American community organizations and activists that is fighting the ongoing mass incarceration, forced removals, family separations, and deportations, really intersectional history in the United States that has targeted communities of color since the beginning. And the Japanese American community certainly knows all about this. But what we know is that whether or not you call it a relocation center, and an internment site, a child intake site, a family residential center, a concentration camp is a concentration camp, a prison is a prison. And what was so significant about that initial protest at Tule Lake when we were formed is that it was really aligning and embracing the historic values and principles of the Tulean community to resist and hold our voice of dissent. And so when we showed up at Dilley detention site in Texas, or at Fort Sill, where we forced them to abandon their proposal to imprison 1,600 children there. When we did that, we were thinking about our survivors from the camps. We were thinking about our ancestors. My mother and her family, I had them in my mind when we were resisting there. It was the first that I know of anyway, group civil disobedience by Japanese Americans opposing state violence. And maybe some folks here have seen the videos of that from Democracy Now!'s coverage of that moment. But it was a sea-changing and life-changing moment for me to stand shoulder to shoulder with my my comrades, Japanese Americans, and we were terrified standing there, and we were resolute. We were not going to be moved. As Satsuki said to the armed soldier, she said, "We've been moved too many times. We're not moving." And I think what that did was, maybe accidentally, it lit a fire of reawakening the luminous center of that spirit within the human being that stands up to injustice. And in doing so, what we accidentally did was we became the allies that our community needed during World War II. And in doing that, powerful healing took place for all of us who showed up there, and I think for many who witnessed what happened. And that work has continued. The healing circles that became part of our direct actions, we would follow the direct actions by gathering together, and it was sort of started initially as a debrief, but really what it was a multi-generational healing circle. And Satsuki, who pioneered this work in her professional practice over the years, really brought this into Tsuru, and we have developed a whole protocol. We've trained, I think, over 150 facilitators now. We have been asked by the National Asian American Roundtable that has formed in the last year around the anti-Asian violence. We have been asked by them and the Asian Law Caucus to run healing circles for members of that roundtable. Some of those organizations are from Atlanta or Indianapolis, all around the country. So the work of Tsuru is not just about resistance, but it's also about healing. We continue to build out our work of solidarity with other communities. And maybe in the question and answer, I can say a little bit more about the ongoing work around detention. But what I will briefly say is that detention is not going away. In fact, under the Biden administration, it's expanding. And last year, over 122,000 unaccompanied children were put in mass detention. Maybe I can just quickly show a couple photos. Kimiko, do you want to? Great, here's one. That's the flyer that we put out when we were organizing to go to Texas last summer to protest at Fort Bliss, where they were holding unaccompanied children. You can go to the next slide. And this is our work to support Lum Lay, who was brought here as a child refugee from Vietnam, abandoned by the US government, ended up in a gang on the street for survival after he was abused, and ended up in prison. And as soon as he served his time, and the moment he left San Quentin, ICE picked him up and is trying to deport him. And this is a beautiful, beautiful man. He is a lovely, lovely human being. And we're working to support him and asking for a direct pardon from the governor of California. Next photo. This is Day of Remembrance 2020 at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, where Tsuru and other Seattle organizations, including Densho and JCL, sponsored a protest. And one more. Here's the protest at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where we opposed the plan to bring 1,600 unaccompanied children to be imprisoned there. And next. That's our very first protest in Texas at the Dilley Detention Center. That's a family residential center, 40 miles down the same highway as the Crystal City Department of Justice internment camp for Japanese Americans. And I think there's one more. And that's another photo. And you can see the 30,000 cranes that were sent by the community to be hung on the fences there. I consider them talismans of the healing and regenerative key of our community. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mike. And as I'm going to invite all of our folks back on screen, I think this was such a fantastic panel for so many reasons, but especially to hear the just breadth of work that is happening within the Japanese American community, drawing from our histories, drawing from, you know, the organizing traditions that have come before. But it's just an inspiring moment. You know, I think at a time when there is a lot to feel frustrated about or feel saddened by, to see these opportunities to come together and fight for justice in different capacities is really fantastic. So we do have some questions from our audience, but I am going to start us off first with a question that I'd like to address to all of you. And I will ask it and then I'll call on someone to start us off. So one of the things that struck me as I was listening to each of you speak is that you've each, through your work, sort of dug into and reckoned with complex and often difficult histories, sometimes family stories, and sometimes that has involved you or you encouraging others to sit with pain and sit with grief and sit with trauma in order to really make sense of, you know, where we come from and where we are now. So I'm wondering about how you approach calling folks into these conversations. How do you open up these spaces? And has there been, you know, resistance to calling people in to sit with this kind of grief or sit with this kind of pain, even as it is an important path to healing? So I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to go first. That is a big question. You can take it in any direction you would like. If not, I think, you know, Kimiko, you're smiling, so I'm going to call on you first.
Well, I think it is difficult to have conversation without trust. And I think that that's something that you get from having places of safety like pilgrimages, which, you know, they all try to provide a very safe environment for you to express your feelings without being attacked by somebody or put down by somebody. So I think that that's a good place to start. You know, obviously Tule Lake was the first one to really embrace that because of its own history, difficult history. And then other pilgrimages have followed suit, which I think is great. And I highly recommend anybody, if they, you know, they have an opportunity to attend a pilgrimage, especially a multi-day pilgrimage, I highly recommend everybody do that, because there also is something to be said about bonding with, you know, 200 to 400 people over a 3 or 4 day weekend, that it really just, you become kind of this tight, cohesive unit for at least those 4 days. But I do think that it's something that is not comfortable within our Japanese American community. We don't typically share our emotions, especially if they're negative. We're kind of supposed to just be quiet and not make anybody feel uncomfortable by our thoughts and emotions. But I think that you can't really have healing until you're able to express these things and discuss them without being silenced, without somebody trying to keep your voice down. Because we all have voices. That's kind of what we say about the United States, right? It's, you have the freedom to express yourself, and people shouldn't try to hinder that. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Kimiko. Yes, Barbara.
Well, since I've been involved with the pilgrimages since 2000, and especially over the last 20 years, we've worked to tell the stories of protest. And I can remember my first pilgrimage, going and standing in the jail, and an older man was standing next to me, and he whispered to me, I was a bad boy. And, you know, it struck me as so sad that, first of all, that he felt like he had to whisper that this was something to be ashamed of. but also that the framing that he was, and this is the way our community had long defined people who protested as bad, as troublemakers, and not troublemakers in the way John Lewis talked about, making good trouble. People who protested, especially in Tule Lake, were marginalized as, like in the comic book cover, as pro-Japan fanatics, and we still get a lot of that sense of, our community is still grappling with the issue of protest, that many people don't see it as something that is important and righteous and something that takes a great deal of courage and integrity. So I'm just so thrilled at the work Karen is doing, telling her father's story, and Mike. I mean, what is more delightful than, organizing a whole new generation and nationwide people who are embracing the idea that, we are a people who share this passion for social justice, and that people are they're expressing enormous courage in their willingness to stand up and speak out and dissent. So it's really a thrill to see you all again too.
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, Mike or Karen, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Karen.
Well, I mean, I had a laugh when Barbara said, troublemaker, because that's what my father was considered as a troublemaker, right? And, as an educator, and I've been learning. I learn something new every day. So this still is a learning process for me. But what I point out, especially to young people, is that at the end of the day, we're all Americans. And whether you're a renunciator, whether you're a no-no, whether you're a draft resistor, whether you're you name it, we still are all Americans. And in this country, that's the privilege we have to demonstrate what does it mean to be an American. My father said, protest, but not with violence, otherwise they won't listen to you. So protest is something in my blood, certainly, and also to point out that there is no right or wrong answer to this. That it doesn't, we still. It's sad for me to say that we still have even a divide in our own Japanese American community, and we all are out there trying to heal, to help heal that process and that divide. You're right about, in order to reach equity, we have to heal first. I mean, whether it's Japanese Americans or African Americans or Latinos, I mean, you name it. We're all kind of had those shared experiences, which I think we need to point out, because the intersectionality, as I said, is important, so we can move forward together as a nation. But yeah, I mean, Kimiko, I want to kind of emphasize what you said, because I've been a kind of a leader in those conversations at the pilgrimages. My eyes were opened to my first pilgrimage, which I think was Tule Lake, and was so grateful now that I've been able to kind of lead those discussions, but also to make it, as Kimiko said, a safe place, right? That and don't, in talking to students, they say, well, my grandparent or great grandparent doesn't want to talk about it. Well, then you can't just expect them to start talking. It just doesn't work that way. But you ask the questions, but ask them in a general manner. Well, how did you feel at that time? Don't make it so personal, and then kind of change it to the personal if that's possible. But everyone needs to find their zone of being comfortable. And once they realize they've shared, it helps to lift them up as well. And I think that's what we want to do in these conversations, and to have them now, especially with the Nisei that, are, we're, and even Sansei, because I'm aging, but to have those conversations now, because it's important, but to make it a safe, environment to have those discussions.
Thanks, Karen. I appreciate deeply your comments. I also want to share that Tule Lake was my first pilgrimage. My family was in Minidoka, but I got involved with the intergenerational facilitation, so I was part of that process there. The first time I went to the pilgrimage, I vomited at the site, because when I experienced the pit where they desecrated the remains of our people, I mean, I get choked up every time I talk about this. Like, it was the most visceral revulsion that I've experienced, and I literally became ill from the fact of what they could do to other human beings there. And it was really in that moment I became very committed to trying to heal the schism in the community that's left over from that time. And I remember Barbara asking the survivors to stand at the opening plenary, and people gave them a standing ovation. And I remember people just weeping openly. And I just thought, this is what healing looks like for our community. This is how we come back together. That people get honored for the stands that they took so courageously and paid such a fierce price for doing so. So in some sense, my life is committed to that work. And that's why I've been connected to the Tule Lake pilgrimage, because I feel like that pilgrimage has really been about the transformation of our community. I think it's imbued in the work of Tsuru, with the healing circles that we've done. There's also been this conversation that we've been having. We've been trying to have a reckoning of some sort and open up conversations that have not really been that public until more recently, maybe since the summer of 2020. But we're looking at things around like the model minority myth and trying to unpack that. And I always say, let's not blame each other for ending up in that position. In some sense, the war and the forced removal and incarceration set us in that dynamic after the war, terrified people who'd been in concentration camps trying to survive in a society that had it out for them, and then held out a carrot and said, go ahead and do this and we'll reward you. And here we are now, pitted oftentimes against other communities of color in that dynamic. And I think there's the beginnings of really open, frank, and we need more of it, but conversations around what is our culpability around the structural racism of the United States, and the healing of our own trauma, multi-generational healing of that trauma, is going to help us to deconstruct the model minority myth and move forward with a new vision of solidarity with other communities of color to really find a way to move away from white supremacy culture and legacy. And that's really exciting. I'll just quickly say a new project that we're incubating at Tsuru. It's a tiny, tiny little baby, but we're talking about trying to preserve Japanese farm culture because it was destroyed largely by the forced removal. And part of deconstructing model minority means reclaiming the erased culture of our community. So we're going to try to find a Japanese American farm and turn it into an organizing center that is devoted to being a regenerative healing space for organizers and a think tank towards solidarity organizing to change the society, while we center traditional Japanese American crafts and arts and our farm culture and healing. So there's so much talk in movement space right now about the trauma that people are experiencing from this pandemic that has accelerated the collapse of late stage capitalism. And so we're trying to think of new ideas and visions of how to go forward together. So it's a baby. We're watering that seed and trying to make it grow.
That is so fantastic. Mia, I want to turn to you as well to hear, because JAXI has done, a lot of work of bringing together, as you said in your presentation, these different groups, preventing us from becoming siloed and sort of staying in our own little community bubbles, even within our Japanese American community. So I want to also ask you about, how you and your work with JAXI is approaching this idea of healing and renewal and these kinds of tough conversations that are so important.
I mean, I think we're doing it right now just by having these panels. I think even 5-10 years ago, you didn't see this. You didn't see this level of collaboration with so many people at the same table having these conversations. And I think so much of that we can, attribute to the power of the pilgrimages that's, I think, transformed everyone on this panel by being in those safe spaces with our community. And then I think what's so inspiring is that all of the work that everyone's talking about is all community led, right? So all of the work to promote the Japanese American history, preserve these stories, preserve these sites is being led by the descendants, by the survivors. And I think that's so powerful and something that we have as a tool to also reach out to other communities and see how we can uplift them to do the same. So Mike, I just love that baby seed. I hope you're watering it, and I hope we can have an all camps consortium meeting at the farm. I'll see you there.
Oh, that's great. And we are fast approaching the end of our time. So I'm going to sort of pull together several wonderful questions from the chat. And with sort of my own question that draws from what each of you has spoken about, which is, what next? What are we need to be thinking about right now? And maybe especially, how do we sort of draw from our community, from this foundation that we've built and that we're continuing to build, to reach out across lines of community, to build that kind of solidarity that you gesture towards, Mike? How do we get there? What do you see as the work that we need to continue doing? I'm going to again ask each of you to answer this question. If anyone wants to jump in first. If not, maybe Barbara, I'll ask you to begin.
Well, I think what I've been involved with some issues at Topaz recently, and I think it's very clear that people have different views of how to preserve the sites, how to interpret the sites, and it is so important for the parties to come together, to treat one another respectfully, to have open, collaborative conversations. I mean, without that, there can be no healing. And the unilateral decision making that can go on at sites. I mean, and this is a tension also within national park sites too, is how do we tell the story, and whose point of view. So it is just so important, I think, in telling the Japanese American story, which is so infused with propaganda, that we need to be really take care, I think, that we are not imposing another layer of this destructive government propaganda in the way we treat one another.
Thank you so much. Karen.
Yes, Barbara, I think you're spot on here. I think what we need to emphasize is transparency in working on these different sites, and respect. I mean, I never thought I'd get to this age in life and have to teach about respect, about moral of right and wrong. It's not complicated, as my father said, the government was wrong and he was right to take a stand. So we can't have our own personal agendas. And we need to work together. We can we can agree to disagree, but then start on those issues, those points that we do agree, and move on from there. It's not really a difficult process, but we need to be mindful and purposeful, and to have these conversations openly and honestly. It's we are kind of, especially with Topaz and the Wakasa Memorial, we're in this big divide again, and it's heartbreaking to think that, well, 80 years later, and this is where we are. It's not acceptable. And if people can't be willing to find that common ground, then they need to move aside. Quite frankly, I think they just don't belong in the conversation, because it's hurting, here again, where it's going to be hurting our own community. And I'm just absolutely upset about this ordeal.
Thank you so much, Karen. Kimiko, I'm going to actually pass to you next. There also is a question in the chat about where folks can learn more about what's happening at Topaz and some of these ongoing community conversations that need to continue happening. So Kimiko, I'll pass to you to answer some of that.
I will put a link in the chat to the Wakasa Memorial Committee's website that you can learn more about the issue there. The short version is that something was done, excavated at the site without notifying anybody. There was no archaeologists there. There were no Japanese Americans there. And it was very hurtful to many people, myself included. My family was in Topaz. So it was a very, for me personally, I had a very helpless feeling, because it was just that agency was taken away from me, and that I had no voice and no say in anything. So I think that, everything that we've all said today it's spot on. It's just a matter of listening to everyone else's opinion. Everyone has a right to an opinion. We don't have to say, oh, we'll do whatever everyone else says. But I think that if somebody wants to give input, they should be allowed to give input. And I think that is something that I can say, at least with the National Park Service, and for instance, with Amachi, they had a whole series of town halls and online town halls, physical town halls before the COVID thing happened, where they solicited input from stakeholders. And that's what you should do. You should try. You should make an effort. You're not going to get to every single person. It's hyperbolic to say, what are you going to just talk to every Japanese American? Of course not. That's silly. But you have to make a good faith attempt. And so that's what I would hope for any sites of conscience, for whatever culture it is, that they do make people who own them or who are the legal steward of these sites, that they make a concerted effort to involve the community, the stakeholders, and to get input from these folks, because it really is, there is much more emotional attachment to it than people might realize. That's all.
Thank you so much, Kimiko. And Mia, I want to invite you. I know we've moved a little bit away from my question, but to think about or leave us with some of your reflections on healing, renewal, justice, maybe this idea of solidarity as we move forward in the weekend.
Well, I actually just want to move back to the next steps in a concrete way. I'm going to drop back to the policy, and obviously policy is not the end all be all. There's many issues we've seen. Even when a site is preserved, there's continue to be threats, continue to be work to be done. But the Japanese American Confinement Education Act, HR 1931, Senate Bill 988, we are looking to move that forward. And like I said, that re-ups the resources available to all of the organizations doing incredible work over the last decades. And if we can put these resources back in the hands of these community leaders to continue to do that work, then we can continue to tease out these stories of solidarity and intersectionality. And I think that's really the road that everyone is looking to take next. So let's get these resources so we can all do that work.
Thank you so much, Mia. And Mike, I'm sorry we keep having you as our final speaker here, but any closing reflections that you'd like to share?
Sure, just a quick couple reflections. One is that Tsuru's been talking to the Wakasa Memorial Committee, and we're going to sponsor like a program so that people can tune in and hear about what's going on. And as a Japanese American community, we need to have these conversations with each other, because we will not once again be divided and conquered. So we need to come together about our shared history, about our shared artifacts, and the sacredness of our legacy together. And so we're in conversation, and that program will happen sometime, hopefully this spring. And just beyond, if we look a little bit further beyond our own community, and we're thinking about solidarity, I just want to lift up that the Japanese American community is rallying around HR 40 and reparations to, the act to create a commission to study reparations for people of African descent in the United States. It's overdue. It's the right thing to do. And it has been stalled and obstructed forever. And the JA community this year really got behind it. Tsuru was approached by some of the leaders of that movement, and we held a community meeting, and over 50 organizations showed up to that meeting. There is great interest in our community to support, and hundreds of letters were submitted for the congressional record for the HR 40 hearing this past year. Kathy Masaoka from NCCRR and Nikkei Progressives of LA was the only non-African American asked to speak for that hearing, and she did a beautiful job representing our perspective. The other thing that we can really get behind is the continued work to end detention in the United States. It's the largest detention carceral system in the world. In 2019, over a half million people were incarcerated in detention in the United States. There is now an intention by the United States to expand influx detention sites for children in the coming months. They've just issued a request for information document stating that they're looking to expand that detention system into 17 states across the country. So detention is not going away under this administration, it's actually expanding. And in the months to come, we are going to have to escalate and meet the intensity of beings with our resistance and civil disobedience. So stay tuned, because the call to action is coming.
Thank you so much, Mike, and a really wonderful way to, gesture towards our programming tomorrow, our last program tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. We'll take up some of these questions of, what do we do moving forward, et cetera. But to wrap this up, thank you so much, each of you, and Mia, Kimiko, Mike, Karen, Barbara, for being here, for sharing your thoughts, for, thinking critically about what healing and renewal and justice can look like and mean. This has been so meaningful to listen to. I'm so grateful to each of you. I know there was also some talk in the chat about wanting to know more about the proclamation. Please tune in again tomorrow. We'll hear from Erica Moritsugu, who's Deputy Assistant to the President, who can talk more about that. And I also, just before we close out, want to again thank our planning partners, the Japanese American National Museum, JACL National Chapter, Friends of Minidoka, the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, Kimiko Marr, who is a wonderful panelist and running everything behind the scenes, and our co-sponsors, the Smithsonian Institution, the National Park Service, and the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. So thank you all so much for being here. I wish you a wonderful, restful rest of the day and weekend. And for those of you watching from home, please join for our final program of the day in about 45 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, and great seeing everybody.